Welcome back, everybody, to part 3 of the Articles of Confederation by Extra History. If you didn't see my reaction to the first 2 episodes, there's a link in the description that'll take you to episode 1. There's also a link to the original content. Make sure you go over and check that out. Give them a like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. We want to support those original content creators however we can. Thank you to all of our new patrons that have been signing up because much of my channel is based around these reaction videos. A lot of these reaction videos get automatically monetized by YouTube for the content creator, which is fine. They've done a lot of hard work to get that. So I rely heavily on things like my original content, some of my reaction videos, depending on what they are, as well as you supporting through Patreon to make this something that I can justify to my family spending time doing. So thank you for that. We're going to dive into part 3. A lot of you were asking about my shirt yesterday, and for some reason the thing was flipped backwards. I've got it fixed now. But that was a shirt that's actually in my merch store, which the link should be on all the videos. And what it said was, "Don't make me repeat myself," and then it was signed History. And since I know you're going to be trying to figure out what it says today, the shirt that I'm wearing today is not a merch shirt. It's just something I got at Walmart, I think. And it says, "I used to be a people person, then people ruined it." Which is kind of funny because, you know, when I'm not doing this, I'm speaking about kindness and compassion for a living. So it's just kind of a joke as an introvert myself. Even though I seem to be an outgoing person, I'm an introvert. And I get peopled out pretty easily sometimes. So none of that matters. Let's dive into part 3 of Articles of Confederation.
For 5 years, the Confederation Congress had struggled to fund a national army to fight the American Revolutionary War. But the war kept going, and Congress had become dead broke. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no real leadership. They elected one of their own members to be President of Congress, but once elected, he could only supervise meetings. He couldn't vote or even suggest new laws.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, John Hancock at one time is the President of Congress. Another guy that serves as President of Congress is Henry Lawrence. If you're familiar with the story of Alexander Hamilton, Henry's son, John Lawrence, is one of the main characters in the Hamilton musical. John Lawrence dies late in the war. He was one of the people who helped Washington, or helped write the terms of surrender at Yorktown. Henry Lawrence actually got captured by the British as president of Congress. It might have been after he was president of Congress. It was confined for a while in the Tower of London during the war.
Many saw it as a demotion, and a few who did get elected wound up trying to resign, only to find out that they were stuck there because nobody wanted to replace them. But now that the Articles of Confederation had been ratified by all 13 states, the first official president of Congress leveraged the optimism of the moment to convince Congress that they needed to create new leadership roles. Most importantly, they needed to appoint a superintendent of finance to fix their desperate money troubles. They immediately nominated Robert Morris, the richest man in America. His knack for business had helped him build his merchant shipping company into a global powerhouse and earned him the nickname the Financier.
So let's talk about Robert Morris for a second. If you're familiar with the part of the country near where I live, Western PA, Northeastern Ohio, there's a Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. Robert Morris, I think, is born in Liverpool in England. As a teenager, he comes to America, Maryland first, and then eventually ends up in Pennsylvania. Interestingly, he was, when the Constitution gets passed, George Washington's first choice to be Secretary of the Treasury. Well, Robert Morris didn't want to serve as Secretary of the Treasury. He actually got elected as one of Pennsylvania's first senators in 1789. He becomes a senator from Pennsylvania. So it's Robert Morris that suggests to Washington that he make Alexander Hamilton the Secretary of the Treasury, which Hamilton does, and the rest is history. But yeah, Robert Morris was considered to be the foremost brilliant financial mind in America at this time.
Ever since the war began, he had worked behind the scenes, converting his merchant fleet into privateer ships that attacked the British Navy, making secret deals with the French to supply weapons to American soldiers, and turning his extensive trade connections into a spy network. He was the obvious choice, but boy did he not want to do it. Americans hated taxes so much that they had literally gone to war with the greatest military power in the world to pay less of them. And now Congress had nominated him to be the guy who got to step in and say, hey, you know that war we started with Britain over the taxes? Well, we're gonna need you to pay more taxes so we can keep doing that. This would require one heck of a pitch. When rumors of this nomination reached Paris, Benjamin Franklin took a break from his hobby of negotiating crucial foreign alliances to write his old friend Morris and persuade him to take the job. The two of them had worked together to establish connections with the French at the start of the war, and Franklin knew just how to appeal to Morris's sense of honor and duty. After 4 months, Morris yielded to the pressure, and
this is what I was saying in last episode. People don't realize all the little things that Benjamin Franklin did to help the country head in the right direction. Even stuff that he doesn't really get credit for. Even little things like, I think he was the guy who wrote the letters of introduction for people like the Baron von Steuben, who comes and helps Washington kind of revamp the army after Valley Forge. So here he is kind of behind the scenes once again pushing Robert Morris to do this. Interesting end to Robert Morris's story. He ends up years later, I think like in the early 1800s, in debtor's prison. The brilliant financial mind botched his own personal finances to the point where he ended up in debtor's prison for a while.
And became America's new financier. Once he did, he threw himself into it. He established the first national bank and used it to create a new, stable currency backed by actual gold and silver. He tallied up the debts owed by each of the states and reminded them that, no, paying those debts to Congress was not optional. They had all signed the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation said, pay up. But his most ambitious project was to create a national tax on imported goods. If it passed, any shipment from a foreign country would have to pay a small fee that would help fund the Confederation Congress.
And for the early part of America, including into when we have the Constitution, this is the primary means of revenue for the federal government, is tariffs, import taxes, things of that nature. That's why in the first century or so of America, the person who was in charge of the importation of goods into New York City, which was our primary import harbor at the time, was one of the most powerful people in America, and it was a highly sought after position because so much of the federal government's revenue came that way. There were no income taxes, there were no property taxes for the federal government, things like that. It primarily came through imports.
This same idea, when suggested by British Parliament nearly a decade ago, had helped to set off the chain of protests that led to the Revolutionary War. And since the Articles of Confederation didn't give Congress any power to issue taxes, Morris would actually need to amend the Constitution to do it. Under the Articles, that meant that he needed all 13 states to agree unanimously on this very unpopular tax. And he came so very, very close. Morris convinced 12 of the 13 states to accept the tax, but in the final hour, little old Rhode Island decided to vote no. As a small state that relied heavily on foreign trade through its crucial harbors, Rhode Island feared that the tax would hit them harder than anybody else. Before Morris could even put together an argument to convince them, Virginia decided to back out of their agreement, and the tax proposal fell apart, bringing Morris's influence down with it. His national bank continued to thrive, but accusations mounted that he had used it to enrich himself and his wealthy investor buddies. The states began to ignore his letters insisting that they pay their debts to Congress, and with no income from the states, plus no income from the new tax that Morris had relied upon, the Continental Army found itself once again out of money, right when George Washington saw a golden opportunity to strike down the British at Yorktown. Morris wound up writing personal checks to pay for the campaign out of his own deep pockets. With his help, plus the support of their French allies, the Continental Army trapped the main British fighting force inside a siege and forced them to surrender over 8,000 soldiers as prisoners of war.
So imagine this. You can't get your own country to fund the war effort that they all signed on to be a part of. And so you leave it to a guy using his personal finances and the King of France, who very soon is going to get overthrown himself, to fund your war effort, to fund an effort that you got behind, but you won't financially support.
Yorktown was a monumental victory. The loss of so many soldiers forced the British to begin the peace negotiations that would one day end the war. But George Washington continued to train his soldiers rigorously, expecting at least one more final decisive battle with the British forces.
Yeah, people automatically think Yorktown ended the war. It didn't. First of all, the war didn't end for, another year and a half after that. And there was still fighting, and there's still a huge British army in New York City that occupies that city and has for most of the war. Washington did not think that Yorktown ended the war just because he took out Cornwallis's force. There's still another British force. There's still a major battle that happens at the Battle of Blue Licks, Kentucky, in the later part of 1782. So there's fighting that continues. John Lawrence, who I mentioned earlier, dies after Yorktown in a fight down in South Carolina.
They made camp outside British-occupied New York City, expecting a fight, and wound up just kinda sitting there waiting awkwardly for the next 2 years as peace negotiations stretched out. The threat of another looming battle didn't seem to worry the states. As bad as they always had been about giving money to Congress, they got even worse now that there was no huge British army marching around to remind them why paying for a national army might be a good idea. Not their problem anymore. But it was Robert Morris's problem. Congress had no money to pay the troops, and he couldn't afford to keep paying them himself. Soon after the victory of Yorktown, he stopped paying the Continental Army entirely. All he could offer was a promise that, after the war, they would receive their money. He hoped. The soldiers were not happy, but they stuck together. For now. With nothing better to do, some officers of the Continental Army left and began to run for political office in their home states. Many of them had been through the starving winter at Valley Forge and shared Washington's complaints that Congress had no power and the states had become too self-involved to get anything done. Unlike the older revolutionaries who hated anything that reminded them of British Parliament, this new generation wanted a strong central Congress to hold together the country that they had literally fought to create.
So you can start to see the beginnings of what becomes our two-party system in America. And it originally forms around the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. It's the people who want a strong central government versus the people who want the states to have all the power and a very weak central government, a confederation like we've currently got. And this is where you're going to start to have that divergence. Now, the parties have changed a lot over the years. We call them party systems, and I think we're in like the 5th or 6th party system now. It's not as simple as saying, well, Republicans today are the Democrats of 100 years ago, that kind of stuff. That whole flip thing is a fallacy. It's much, much more complicated than that. But the parties do change over time. But we always have had this major two-party system, but it started there.
Robert Morris found new allies in this crop of young politicians. Chief among them was Alexander Hamilton, the famous hero of Yorktown and George Washington's right-hand man, who joined the Confederation Congress in 1782. Morris and Hamilton bonded over their shared love of national banking systems, because everybody's got to have a hobby, and they soon united to bring back the tax amendment once again. They believed it was the only way for Congress to raise enough money to pay the Continental Army. But now that peace looked more and more likely, the states had a different idea. How about not paying the Continental Army? Several states proposed that the army should be disbanded entirely, letting the local state militias take care of any remaining British resistance.
And one of the ways that they tried to deal with this issue of the Continental Army was that they gave them all basically these promises of land, and also bonds that could be cashed in after the war. In a lot of places like eastern Kentucky, for example, a lot of this land, remember we talked about in the previous episode about how all this land west of the Appalachian Mountains is now going to be open to settlers. Well, the government's got all this land out there, and this is a way of both compensating the army and also populating that land. And so that's why you see, like with my family being primarily settled in eastern Kentucky, a huge majority of my ancestors who settled in eastern Kentucky did so on grants that they received for Continental Army service. But these bonds, these IOUs that they were given to be cashed in later on once the government was established and could pay them, became a big source of conflict later under the Constitution, because a lot of these men were afraid they were never going to see the money. And so speculators came along and bought them up on pennies for the dollar. So if you had $1,000 worth of these bonds, they might give you $50 for it, thinking that the government would come through and it would be a great investment. I'll pay you $50, and then later on I'll cash in for the $1,000. And so then there's this whole issue where they actually fight to force these bonds to only be able to be cashed in by the original owners, but then that would screw all the people who invested in them. And so there's that kind of stuff down the road that's coming. The financial mess just goes far above and beyond anything to do just with the war itself.
If Congress wanted to complain that it couldn't maintain a national army, then it only made sense to disband that army rather than let it continue to rack up debt while everybody waited for word on the peace talks. The soldiers did not see it that way. They had been underpaid from the beginning, and they'd spent the last few months with no pay at all. Many of them literally couldn't afford to go home. They had fallen deeply in debt fighting without pay, and they knew that the second they left the army, they would be thrown into prison for those debts. Their trust that Congress would take care of them evaporated. Murmurs began to circulate through the army camp, threats of an insurrection. They demanded their pay from Congress immediately, and warned that if anybody tried to disband the army, they would rebel. Since George Washington had always made it clear that he served at the pleasure of Congress, they were even prepared to replace him with a new general. The United States had barely been born, and already it faced a coup d'etat and a potential civil war. Receiving word of this brewing conspiracy from his old friends in the army, Hamilton can't help but be frustrated. This is exactly why he's been warning everybody about the consequences of a powerless Confederation Congress. He writes a letter to Washington, his old commander, to warn him about the conspiracy. Then he doubles down on his efforts to pass the amendment tax.
And Washington does something brilliant in all of this. He actually comes in at one point to address the officers who are kind of complaining and on the verge of rebellion and wanting to march on Congress with the army. And he goes up, and it's this real dramatic moment where he goes to speak, and he pulls out some notes that he wanted to use to speak to them. And then he says this thing where he's like, hold on a second, and he pulls out his glasses. And this was kind of a big deal because it wasn't something he typically did, to wear glasses in front of the men, because it might kind of show weakness and that kind of thing. And so he pulls out the glasses and he puts them on, and he takes a moment and he basically says, not only, you have to pardon me as I put on my spectacles, because I've not only grown pretty much broke, but I've also gone almost blind in the service of my country. And he kind of shames them with that by basically saying, look at what I have sacrificed to help win our independence. How can you turn on this government now? How can you not sacrifice as much as I have? And it kind of, for a while, puts to death the idea of rebellion, but it does eventually kind of come to a head later.
Hoping that the threat of an army uprising will finally convince these states to work with them on raising money. Back in camp, Washington receives Hamilton's warning with grim composure. He is aware of the army's unrest, and he sympathizes with his soldiers, but he wanted to believe that their patriotism would prevent them from committing treason against the Republic. Now he has to get involved. He schedules a meeting with his army on March 15th.
This is probably going to be the thing I just talked about. I had no idea it was going to talk about this in detail. I tried to wait to find out if it would, but I didn't want to wait so long as to skip over that moment.
The famous Ides of March, the day Julius Caesar was assassinated by his former friends in Rome. He wants to make it very clear that he considers these threats a betrayal. Stepping up to speak to his army on that fateful day, Washington launches into a prepared speech condemning the conspiracy. Then he pulls out a letter from Congress. He says he'll read it to them, but instead he pauses. He squints at the small letters on the page. At last he pulls out a pair of reading glasses and begs the soldiers to forgive him, for I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country.
So I was a little off. He didn't talk about being broke. He talked about going gray. Remember, George Washington was about my age during the Revolutionary War. I've got some gray too, but he wasn't an old man. He was in his early 40s at this time.
The soldiers do more than forgive him. They remember the days spent on campaign, the brutal winters and the deadly battles that Washington had led them through. They can see how much it has cost him, and they're reminded why they loved him in the first place. Nobody even cares about the letter anymore. By the time he's finished reading it, they rise to pledge their faith in him and their loyalty to Congress. The conspiracy has shattered.
So I want to correct myself. He was in his early 40s when the war started. By this point, he's 50 or 51.
With this major disaster averted, everybody realizes the importance of banding together as a unified country to support the army and give Congress the resources it needed. I am, of course, kidding. The tax amendment failed again, and Robert Morris resigned. Join us next time as the Confederation falls apart.
Yeah, join us next time as the Confederation falls apart. It is a small miracle that this nation survived itself in those early years. It's incredible to me that with all the infighting, with everything that went wrong, with all the mistakes that were made, that somehow it was pulled all together anyway. And you can kind of see this. So I think now we're going to get to the phase where we're going to start talking about the need for a constitution, which is a fascinating process in and of itself. And itself then sets up the problems that will eventually lead to the American Civil War. So all history is tied together. One event always leads to the next, which leads to the next. It's a fascinating thing to watch unfold. And we will continue that tomorrow. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Hit that like button if you would. And we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.